The Historic Real Estate Office, or we called it the HREO in writing, but it's easier to say Historical Real Estate Office. Anyway, the project began over 10 years ago, but it got shelved pending larger projects and, of course, COVID. And so many of you may have forgotten about this project. But back in 2012, the Historical Society got an email from Rick Marabito, who is the owner of two businesses, Rick's Rain Gutters and Advanced Painting, which you may recall were down on Valley Drive behind Vaughn's Market. Vaughn's needed more parking, of course, and they bought the land that Rick's Rain Gutters was on. Rick informed the Historical Society that he had a small gray shed on the back of his lot that had once been one of the original real estate offices in town. And because he had to relocate, he was offering this little building to the Historical Society. This was amazing news. A real estate office from the past had suddenly resurfaced. But it raised a lot of questions. Was it really a real estate office from back in the day? Could we prove it? Could we restore it? Where would we keep it? Where would it go? And of course, was it important enough to save? But as I just explained in excruciating detail, real estate is a big deal in Manhattan Beach. And this was an artifact from back in the day of the real estate industry. It would have been really easy to politely decline and to say, to let the supposed real estate office be destroyed with Rick's Rain Gutters to make room for the parking lot. But real estate's key to our town, and the little building that we initially referred to as the Gray Shed was a genuine find. It was a relic of the past era when it was all about selling land and enticing people to move in and build our town. The building was approaching 100 years old. Still is approaching 100 years old, nearly 100 years old. It was incredible that the structure still existed in a town that's prone to scraping the old buildings to make room for new buildings. So Steve Meisenholder, past president of the Historical Society, and I began researching the structure. It's really small. It's 12 by 14 feet, about the size of a parking space. But then even homes back in the day were often quite small. Like, for example, even our little museum, the Red Cottage, was a home, and it's tiny, particularly by today's standards. The building was dilapidated, although seemingly sound structurally, and it needed restoration. A quick examination showed that the construction materials were consistent with the early Manhattan Beach methods. Rick Marabito had grown up in Manhattan Beach, and he used to play in the little shed, which was behind Keaton's Lumber Yard and construction at the time. Rick said that there were real estate papers and brochures inside that he collected to use for scratch paper at home. You guys remember scratch paper, right? I don't think my kids know what scratch paper is. But he couldn't recall the name of the realtor. A friend of his, Clayton Shepard, said that Marshall Kuhn had told him that it was one of the first real estate offices. So we had some verbal confirmation anyway, initially. It was quickly noted that the Gray Shed appeared to be virtually it was in great shape. It was quickly noted that the Gray Shed appeared to be virtually a mirror image of the Doherty's building at 22nd and Speedway, or Marine and Ocean, as we call them now. The Doherty Real Estate Office bore this signage that everybody loves to see on the walls of the brand new shiny restaurants in town that say, oceanfront lots, $50 down, $10 per month. Wow. Princely incomes to buy a home. Extensive research was done to try to find whose real estate office it had been. In the early years, a lot of people had tried their hand at selling real estate. Some just hung a shingle on their house and worked from home, like the Lindsays. Some of them had little small shacks that served as offices in strategic locations. You could work out of this, couldn't you, Dave?
Oh, yeah.
Usually near trolley stops or by the Santa Fe station up at Center Street. They wanted to be right there when the trolley arrived so they could sell land. So we did extensive research. We checked the directories, which there are several of, and we looked in the newspaper for advertisements and so on and so forth. But we didn't really have a specific year, so we had to check from 1913 going forward. Steve Meisenholder consulted the 1927-1930 Sanborn fire insurance map, which shows all the buildings in town at the time and is conveniently drawn to scale. That means we could match it up, the figures on the map with our shack. The only structure that seemed to match, in fact, was situated at 410 Center Street at the Kuhn's lumber yard. So we could find it on the map where it was still today. But we couldn't find any documentation initially that linked it to a real estate office. Directories and ads for the Kuhn's all referred to 408 Center Street, which was a separate building on the property. We did find a 1918 aerial photograph of the Kuhn yard that shows the shed on the property, although only the roof and the back of the shed can be seen. That's the center bottom down there. You can see that little building there with a car next to it. I don't have my point. There were so many real estate agents in the early years, although admittedly there's a lot of real estate agents now. God, who doesn't know at least 8 real estate agents? I know a bunch of them. Anyway, there was Meacham, William Smith, Walter Wilkinson, Gibson Howard, Albert E. Lockwood, Edward H. Platt, Irvin T. Thompson, Melvin J. Gandolfo, John and Molly Jones, Edward H. Platt, R.F. Wedler, William W. Peppers, Martin A. Young, and those were just the real estate offices located within a reasonable location of the Kuhn yard with the possibility that the shed had been moved. The Historical Society, there's the Jones Real Estate Building. The Historical Society proposed moving the shed to Pollywog Park on the east side of the parking lot and restoring it to resemble a typical real estate office at the time. The location that we wanted to put it was at the corner of a grass lawn, about midway between the Cottage Museum and the old restroom facilities there, and basically right next to that water pumping station. It's a lovely neighborhood. It was proposed that restoration work could be done as an Eagle Scout project. We'd get Boy Scouts to come in and do volunteer work. They'd raise money, they'd have volunteer labor, and they'd do the work. The school district approved the project, and they approved the location for this little shed. City Council also approved the project, but they chose to move the shed to the city yard for restoration, rather than doing the work at the park, which makes sense because, otherwise they have to fence it, you got a construction project going on, kids want to get in there, blah, blah, blah. So they said, let's move it to the city yard. All right, that's the spot I'm talking about there. It's just the corner of the grass lawn, basically. Yes. The shed was moved by a building moving company. They used to have house moving companies. They're almost all gone today because we don't move buildings any longer. We just tear them down and build a new one. But at the time, they moved buildings quite a bit. And this one is so small, they basically winched this thing up onto a trailer and took off down the street. I was trying to take pictures of them, and they're going over the speed limit with this trailer, with this little shack on top of it, right? But they moved it right along. Eventually, we took another look at the Sanborn map, and we caught a break. The Sanborn map had originally been published in 1927. And then they made corrections in 1930, corrections and additions. They updated the Sanborn map. And the way they did it back then, instead of just publishing a new volume, is they did the drawings, cut out pieces of paper, and pasted them inside the old volume, because that was cheaper. And so we took a look at those pages again, and you'll see that there's a page there that's been, a piece of paper that's been glued on top there. It shows up at 313 Center Street, just across the street and half a block down. That same size little shack shows up at 313 Center Street. And then they put a piece of paper over it because it was gone. And they put a new piece of paper at the Kuhn yard. There it was. It got moved across the street. That's a weird way to do corrections on a book, but that's the way it was. The city directory from 1927 showed William W. Peppers and Patmore as realtor at 313 Center Street. Newspaper ads for the address were found, as well as ultimately a news story reporting that Mr. Peppers donated the use of the building for the Chamber of Commerce to use as an office in 1927. So they sold real estate for a little while and then said, nah, not for them. Like so many people. But who were Peppers and Patmore? Peppers and Patmore were immigrants. They were veterans of World War I who had served in Canada. Not in Canada, for Canada. They were from Canada, and they weren't yet U.S. citizens, so they fought for the Canadians. And they then immigrated to the United States to find a home. They were buddies. They roomed together for quite a while until Pat Patmore eventually got married. They worked a number of jobs like people did back in the day, including real estate. And it seemed after a stint in real estate, they offered, like I said, they offered the structure to the Chamber of Commerce. Walter Peppers was born in Canada. Ed Patmore, who's known as Pat, was born in London, England, and then he immigrated to Canada before coming to the United States. It is unknown how in heck they ended up in Manhattan Beach in the 1920s. Wow. But Ed Patmore was the proprietor of the bait house and the restaurant at the head of the pier there, at the base of the pier, I guess. And Mr. Peppers was running the hardware store. Then over time, they started doing a whole bunch of stuff. They sold electrical appliances, they did plumbing, they sold auto supplies. Patmore and Peppers ran the plumbing shop, advertising hardware and plumbing. Ed Patmore was the proprietor of the bait house, like I said, and Peppers was running the hardware store. This is Mr. Patmore with Peppers' brother. Patmore Mr. Patmore was elected president of the Surf and Pool Association of Southern California in 1930. This was basically an 80-member organization of proprietors of bathhouses. I don't think the association existed this time. But he was the president of an organization that ran from Santa Cruz down to San Diego. They were still listed as partners running the restaurant and the bathhouse on the pier in 1931. But Pat Patmore joined the Manhattan Beach Police Department in 1935, and he was an officer for 10 years. And then at the age of 51, the work at the end of his life, and he died in 1941 at the age of 54. They both died pretty young. To restore the historic real estate office, we approached the Boy Scouts. There were actually 2 Eagle Scout projects to do the restoration. Got a note here to page through a bunch of these. Dave. The first one was done by a young man named Hunter Bernard from Manhattan Beach Troop 849. The real estate office was repaired, repainted, and re-roofed. New windows and a door were installed. There was a second Eagle project. He made Eagle. There was a second Eagle project done by a young man named Stephen Lambert, also from Troop 849, and he did wiring inside and built window boxes inside because we were not allowed to show the interior of the building. We actually were going to use it for storage originally. The Eagle Scout candidates each did fundraising for the project, and several $1,000s were collected for the Historical Society. Hundreds of volunteer hours were expended on the project. And eventually, we were trying to decide what to do with the exterior because there were photographs of the outside of their real estate office when it was a real estate office. Actually, what we find, what I found anyway, is that something like 80% of the photographs of Manhattan Beach are photographs down the hill of the pier or standing on the pier looking up at the downtown. It's kind of a shame that they just didn't take as many photos of the outside of things as we'd like. It'd be great to see some old pictures of Hercules. But so we thought, okay, the thing to do would be to mimic the $50 down, $10 a month signage on the outside of the building. They weren't all painted that way. So like I said, sometimes it just was a sign that said real estate. But this was a pretty spectacular building, and it makes for spectacular signage on the side of our speculative exterior. We had some glitches with the city. For starts, the building had to be tested for asbestos and lead paint. Because I guess kids chew on buildings or something like that, but we were cleared of asbestos, but the paint was found to have lead, and so the choice was whether we were going to sand it all down and paint it, or whether we were going to encapsulate the building's paint job. And we chose to encapsulate it. These are a couple of guys in their hazmat outfits working on the building because we want to maintain the patina or the texture of an antique building. If we sanded it all down, we'd just have a shiny new shed. But we wanted the antique look to be retained. Also, the overlapping metal corners had to be replaced because removing them for painting damaged them, and they're no longer commercially available. So an adult volunteer named Tim Shoemaker who had access to a metal shop, made hundreds of little metal corners for the shed. And then the city decided that we needed architectural drawings for bolt tie downs to a concrete foundation for this shed that sat for 100 years just on the ground in case of a high wind event or an earthquake. So that held us up for a little while. The next situation arose was regarding ADA requirements, because if we were even going to use it to store chairs, it has to be ADA compliant. So we said, okay, how about we just throw a desk in there and a hat rack and a calendar on the wall and pretend it's a real estate office. I said, no, because you have to have ramps up so that you can see inside this 12 by 14 foot shed. It became one of those deals. There's a lot of regulations going on with buildings nowadays. But we did bring up the side of the building. So we went from this to this. The city, of course, owns the building. The city owns, as I've said repeatedly, the city owns the Red Cottage, it owns this building, it owns all the archives inside, and there are pluses and minuses to that, but one of which is that the city has more money than we do. So they're getting ready to build essentially a library extension over where the old restrooms were. They've asked us for the time being to hold our horses and to not move the cottage yet, because they don't want it to be in the way and they may want to reposition it and so on and so forth. And that's fine.
The shed, not the cottage.
I'm sorry?
Not the cottage.
Oh, I'm sorry. I keep saying cottage instead of real estate office. I did it all night yesterday too. Anyway, they want to be able to properly site the real estate office so they don't have to move a second time. Because by God, if they're going to build a concrete platform and bolt it down to the ground, they don't want to do it twice, which makes a certain amount of sense. But at this point, we're really looking forward to, I'm looking forward to actually getting the real estate office placed over by the cottage, which seems like an appropriate location for an historic building. Essentially would be, in my mind, it would be basically between the cottage and the new facility. And it would just be this snazzy little building that you can stand in front of and get your picture taken and say, how can you believe the cost of property in Manhattan Beach? That's the historic real estate office. This is the best picture I have of it because it is at the city yard, and so they often have containers and stuff piled up in front of it. But this is the best shot that I've got of it at this time. That pretty much wraps it up. For those of you who can't read it, that says what I think I look like when I talk about history and what I actually look like when I talk about history. Because that's me.